Antichrist is one of the most divisive pieces of art house shock cinema that I've personally ever seen. Von Trier is a filmmaker that certainly likes to provoke a reaction out of his viewers, regardless if it turns negative or positive. But most of y'all who clicked on this video probably know all about Von Trier as a filmmaker, so I won't dive much into that. I want to talk about his film Antichrist and the themes demonstrated in this film, and why I think most of it leads back to the concept and reality of chaos in our universe. Let's begin with analyzing the iconic Chaos Reigns scene. This is the scene where Willem Dafoe is kind of wandering through the forest and eventually stumbles upon a fox that is apparently ripping a piece of his flesh off. The style in which the scene is shot leading up to the fox has this kind of handheld, improperly framed aesthetic to it, which I can see some people perceiving as a bit amateur, but with a filmmaker like Von Trier, I think it would be an intellectual mistake to stop there and not dig a bit deeper than that. This isn't the only scene that has this raw handheld aesthetic to it. The film is filled with this type of approach to cinematography. I interpret this as Von Trier attempting to capture an aesthetic that appears more off the cuff and improvisational. I think he intended for there to be an aspect of the aesthetic to appear less controlled and constructed, and I believe that this is further validated through the words of the lead actress Charlotte Gainsbourg. The Criterion copy of Antichrist includes an interview with Charlotte Gainsbourg where she is asked a mountain of insightful questions relating to her experience with the filmmaking process. At one point, she mentions that the script was so loose that her and Dafoe would essentially have no idea what they were going to film that day and how they were going to act it out. She stated that Von Trier would just give them a few describable points regarding the context of the scene and then just say action. She stated that the vast majority of the acting in the film was improvisational. I believe this is a point that, in fact, further substantiates that Von Trier wanted the film to have a raw, off-the-cuff, and dare I say, chaotic essence to it. This is why I believe the handheld, amateur-looking cinematography that's scattered throughout the film was an intentional choice to further emphasize its central theme regarding chaos. There's also another layer to this that I'll dive into in just a bit. So Dafoe's character approaches the bushy opening he heard noises from, and once he reaches in, we get the iconic Chaos Reigns scene. Willem Dafoe jolts his hand away as we hear a sudden dark, piercing low bell sound from the score, and the entire encounter is shot in slow motion. We see Dafoe giving the fox an intense stare as we see the fox slowly rip out a piece of its own flesh. Then the fox, in an unsettling and low demonic voice, says the words, "Chaos reigns." So the first thing I'm going to discuss here is the sudden change in cinematography. Notice how it goes from the handheld style straight to a more cinematic, controlled, and immersive aesthetic approach. The entire film switches back and forth between both styles of filmmaking, and I believe that this is to further make the film unpredictable and disorienting in order to fully capture and embody Von Trier's desired theme regarding chaos. The constant conflicting styles can be off-putting for many people, but I believe that was ultimately his goal. But another aspect of this film worth discussing is pointing out that the fox doesn't literally mouth the words "Chaos Reigns." He didn't use CGI to make sure the lips match the voice and words. Some might say that this is cheap, cheesy, and lazy, but in all honesty, not only does this make it even more genuinely frightening, but it further emphasizes and demonstrates the psychological center point of the film. But before I dive deep into that, we have to answer this very important question. Why chaos? What does chaos have to do with the film, and why did Von Trier choose this as its central theme? Well, notice how Von Trier decided to establish this film's setting in nature. Pretty much the entirety of Antichrist takes place in nature, and almost all of its imagery is intertwined with aspects of nature. Nature couldn't be a better center point for its theme of chaos, because the essence of nature functions and thrives on chaos and disorder. Nature is truly something that I like to describe as it is what it is, and operates without any empathetic regard for the life that dwells within it. And this is where the psychological aspect of the film comes into play. The reason why we have these evil and sinister depictions of nature throughout the film is because of our flawed humanistic perception of nature. A great establishing shot of this concept is in an earlier scene where we see a plant's roots inside of a cup of water from afar that at first glance appears relaxing and calming, but once the camera starts zooming in extremely close to it, it starts to have a more sinister appearance. I believe this is to demonstrate the idea that human beings at surface level like to view nature as something that's relaxing, but once it starts affecting your life more negatively and personally, you start to look at it closer and perceive it in a much more evil and sinister way. But essentially, it's a human being's psychological responsibility to respond to nature's chaos, which is why anxiety and depression are a crucial element to the film. Depression and anxiety is a way that human beings respond to chaos and the results of this chaos. Specifically in this film, it's a response to the tragic loss of their toddler. So now, with all of those thematic concepts put into context, we can now go back to the Chaos Reign scene and explain what I think it means a little bit better now. We left off on the fact that the fox's lips don't mouth the actual words Chaos Reigns. This is something that I think is crucial to demonstrating the psychological element to the film. This scene is Willem Dafoe's psychological response to what he is witnessing. It's like he is being consumed and possessed by what humans would perceive the ugly natural event of a fox ripping up its own flesh. So the reason why the fox's lips don't match the actual words is because this is Dafoe's psychological projection of what's happening and is not actually occurring in reality. The fox being there is arguably occurring, but the fox saying Chaos Reigns in a disturbing demonic voice is a product of Dafoe's mind. And this obviously isn't the only piece of disturbing imagery depicting nature as sinister in the film. 5 moments in this film come to mind: the sex scene against the tree, the baby bird falling out of a tree, and the 3 animals known as the Three Beggars. I believe all of these moments in the film have meaning to them, and I'm going to attempt to interpret them in my own way. Some might say I'm reaching too far and that I'm reading into something that isn't there, and that might be true to an extent, but all I know is that Von Trier isn't the kind of filmmaker to just make something scary for the sake of being scary. The wonderful thing about art pieces like this is that it's open to interpretation as long as someone makes a compelling argument relating back to the context the art presents. So anyway, the iconic sex scene against a tree is an interesting and dark piece of imagery to say the least. At first it looks like a normal tree, but once the camera pulls away from Dafoe's head, it reveals what appears to be a bunch of pale limbs from dead bodies poking out between the roots of the tree, giving it a hellish appearance. I think there are 2 ways to look at this. The first one being a symbolic representation of their current relationship and status. Dafoe wanted to go to Eden in order to help his wife conquer her phobias through his therapeutic methods. But at this point, he's corrupted and failed so much of what he set out to do by having sex with her multiple times and continuing to cater to her unhealthy desires.
Never screw your therapist, no matter how much your therapist may like it.
Not that consensual violence in the bedroom is inherently a bad thing, but within the context of this film, I'd say that it's more of a negative thing that isn't necessarily bringing her closer to being well again. So the Tree of Corpses are a symbolic representation of their doomed relationship and future. Another and more simplistic way to look at it is that they represent the women that suffered their deaths in vain to the misogynistic practices of witchcraft accusations. Charlotte's thesis in the film revolved around this subject, and she ended up being too far gone and lost in her research. The ending of this film also reveals the souls of all the women who lost their lives to witch trials walking toward the cabin at Eden. But I could honestly be wrong about that as well. So moving on to the baby bird scene, I found this one to be a bit more obvious and on the nose. We see Charlotte have a successful therapy session, but suddenly witnesses a baby bird falling out of a tree and into an anthill. We see the baby bird being eaten by ants and then suddenly gets picked up by a hawk and begins to be eaten alive. Charlotte begins to cry, and I believe it's mostly because it directly reminds her of the tragic loss of her child that fell out of a window to his death. So I think the baby bird falling out of the tree and suffering a tragic death is a metaphor for the loss of her own child, who also fell from a place of high elevation. It also serves as another representation of the ruthless and chaotic essence of nature. So now we move on to what the film calls the Three Beggars. I believe the name comes from a Serbian fairy tale called The Story of the Three Wonderful Beggars. The story also has a moment where a baby gets thrown off a cliff, so I'm sure there is some relation there, but I believe Antichrist has its own independent meaning for each beggar, which are the deer, the fox, and the crow. Or it could possibly be a raven, but it's a black bird that looks like a crow to me. But let me start off by saying that Von Trier himself said that he isn't sure of what he intended each animal to mean in his own film. In an interview where he was asked specifically about the Three Beggars, he says, and I quote, "Truthfully, I can only say I was driven to make the film, that these images came to me and I did not question them. My only defense is, forgive me for I know not what I do. I am really the wrong person to ask what the film means or why it is as it is. It is a bit like asking the chicken about the chicken soup." So I'm sure some people would say that this makes it less meaningful, but I honestly don't believe that. I strongly believe in the film and art subconscious, where artists create what they feel but can't really pinpoint an exact meaning to it. So anyway, Defoe encounters a deer, which is the first beggar he comes across. The deer has a half-birth fetus sticking out of it as it runs off into the wilderness. This again, I think, is supposed to demonstrate the harsh and imperfect essence of nature, but I also believe it's supposed to represent their botched attempt at raising a child and having a family. So next he encounters the fox, and that's when we get the iconic chaos rain scene, which we already discussed, but I do believe that there is another layer to this that I haven't really tackled yet. When the fox tears away a piece of its own flesh, I believe that this is representing both the self-destructive element of nature and the self-destruction of his marriage. Nature is inherently self-destructive. I love using the example of star explosions. Whenever a star reaches its age limit, it expands and explodes, which in result creates new stars and new planets with the stardust. In nature, you'll find in many regards that things must be destroyed in order for the new to arise. In reference to the characters' marriage, they both inhibit self-destructive behavior that ultimately leads to a horrible downfall. Defoe continues to engage in sexual acts that he knows isn't a positive thing to do during therapy sessions. He also consistently disregards her feelings as being childish, delusional, and illogical.
It's all very touching. If it was a children's book. Acorns don't cry. You know that as well as I do.
Charlotte also self-destructs in many ways, but one way that sticks out is that she convinces herself that women must be inherently evil after getting lost in her thesis regarding witchcraft and demonization of women. She also demonstrates an example of self-mutilation near the end of the film. She lays down next to an injured and subdued Defoe, as she is reminded how she essentially allowed her child to die. So she takes a pair of scissors and cuts off her clitoris. She did this intentionally to try and achieve justice of her own actions through her own pain and self-destruction. And lastly, we have the crow, or the raven. Defoe encounters the crow when he is attempting to hide from Charlotte inside the foxhole. He seems to have successfully hidden from her until he digs up a crow that begins to constantly squawk. Defoe tries to pound it to death, but it just refuses to die. The squawking alerts Charlotte of Defoe's location and proceeds to eventually drag him out. I think the crow represents revelation, because it helps reveal the location of two important things. It assists Charlotte in revealing the location of Defoe, and it also assists Defoe in revealing the location of the wrench underneath the floorboard that is needed to remove the heavy object that is screwed into his leg. And that's really my interpretation of the Three Beggars, and honestly covers everything I have to say at this point. I really hope that this analysis was insightful to you in some way, and if you really enjoyed what I had to say about Antichrist, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it amongst other Kino Lords, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be updated on more film-related content.